That bell's gonna ring. Yep. All right. Well, that is definitely our cue to get started. So, first things first, I want to thank Barrett for covering for me last week and did a great job. But we're going to pick back up where we left off, which is Hosea 11. We're going to be about halfway through the chapter. So we're going to be in Hosea 11 this morning. Where we left off last time, we started in chapter 11 of Hosea, where, primarily throughout the book, the picture God has used to describe the covenant between him and Israel has been, marriage. But chapter 11 is a little bit of a shift. It's a father talking to, a child. And the first half that we got to read a couple weeks ago talks about how, this father has loved this child, but the child has rebelled every step along the way and called out for something different. And that's where we left off when we get, where we're going to start this morning, verse 8. So, as we get started, can I get somebody to read verse 8 through 11? Verses 8 through 11.
How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I set you like Zeboim? My heart churns within me, my sympathy is stirred. I will not execute the fierceness of my anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not man, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come with terror. They shall walk after the Lord, he will roar like a lion. When he roars, then his sons shall come trembling from the west. They shall come trembling like a bird from Egypt, like a dove from the land of Assyria, and I will let them dwell in their houses, says the Lord.
So, as we're reading this, what emotion is God expressing about Israel here? Constraint. I think that's part of it. Yeah, he doesn't want to give them up. He absolutely loves them. This is God's heart breaking. This is heartbreak. How can I give you up? How can I surrender you? God doesn't want to destroy these people. He loves them. And he desires them, ultimately to draw back to him. He doesn't want them to go away. He doesn't want them destroyed. And there's a couple interesting little pieces here. One, for I am God and not man. Right? I think that's an interesting line, right? God takes time in this lament from himself to say, look, I'm not like you. I'm not going to destroy you because I am not like man. Why would God say that? He's really showing some restraint. This is how I've come to think about it. When somebody does you wrong, how easy is it for you just to outright go at them, to attack? It's relatively easy. It's really easy, right? But it shows some real restraint. Restraint that we're not always capable of, it seems. But God here is saying, I am capable of a restraint that you are not. I mean, let's just take Israel as a whole. We get Israel starting all the way back in Exodus, and we have it running up even through the time of Christ, if you just want to take from Exodus to 70 AD when the temple's destroyed. How much restraint does God show Israel in that time? Loads of restraint, time and time and time again. Now, put yourself in God's shoes dealing with these people. Would you show that same restraint? Could you show that same restraint? I see a whole lot of heads shaking no. Yeah. I know, I definitely know I could. Look, I get impatient. I can't deal with it sometimes. But God's saying there's a difference between me and you.
I think Peter was thinking it was a lot of times to forgive his brother 7 times.
You're right, yeah. Peter probably does think, hey, forgiving somebody 7 times is a lot. And then Jesus says 70 times 7. Not that you're only supposed to forgive him X amount of times. The whole entire point is God's forgiven you a whole lot. Forgive your brother the same. And God shows restraint even here. The same idea all the way back in Hosea. Jeff?
A lot of the Bible history occurs in periods of 400 years. In 2 years, the United States will have existed for 250 years. And are we the same we were when we were founded?
Well, it's a good question.
And so we've still got 150 years to go to even be to one period of their history. So it is very long suffering.
God is a long-suffering God. And he's talking about it here. Like I said, I see the heartbreak of God across these verses. He's not happy. He's very upset. He's been very restrained and very patient. And one other thing here, too. Verse 11. They will be roused like birds from Egypt, like doves from the land of Assyria. Does that sound like another passage in Hosea? I think Jeff may have referred to it as bird brains a few weeks ago. It's chapter 7, verses 11 through 12. God talks about catching them like these senseless doves, these senseless birds who are flying away to these other nations. And now it seems here in chapter 11 when he's talking about his restraint and his love for them and his want for, well, not to give them up. He's reversing that image. He's saying, you're going to come to me. You're going to fly out of these nations.
Several prophets say the same thing. You go to Isaiah chapter 11, starting in verse 11 through verse 16, it says, then it will happen on that day that the Lord will again recover the second time with his hand the remnant of his people who remain from Assyria, Egypt, Paphos, Cush, Liam, Shinar, Hamath, and from the islands of the sea. You go down to verse 16, it says, and there will be a highway from Assyria for the remnant of his people who will be left, just as there was for Israel. In that day, they will come up out of the land of Egypt. Of course, this is all messianic, and it's talking about ultimately God's going to bring in initially the Israelites from all over, all mankind. But almost the exact same wording. And then in Zechariah chapter 10 says almost the same thing.
Mhm.
Bringing them in from Egypt and Assyria. So he's going to return at some point all of his people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a good thought to bring up. Like, this is messianic, right? Because this is also Hosea 11 verse 1 that Matthew quotes in his gospel, Matthew 2:15, about out of Egypt I've called my son, right? God's going to bring all the people back to him. That's his goal. That's what he was desiring. That's the point even here. He's talking to these rebellious nations. He's saying, look, my desire is not for your judgment. It's for you to return to me. Don't choose Baal and Assyria and Egypt and all these things anymore. Choose me. That's what he truly desires. And I think it's interesting as well, right after the bird image, then I will settle them in their homes. This is the Lord's declaration. This whole little chunk here of Hosea 11, well, this part before verse 12 ends with this look towards a future restoration, right? God is saying, look, there's going to come a time I can restore you. We can bring you back. You can come back. You're not too far gone. I can settle you again. Oh, both those popped up at the same time. In verse 12, can I get somebody to read that for me real quick? So the chapter 11 seems to end with kind of like, you take a picture. It's a snapshot, right? We've just looked towards this future restoration, and here's where you're at right now, right? Well, doesn't sound like Israel or Ephraim is in a great spot, right? Surrounds me with lies and deceit, and, well, that's their problem. And then Judah, the southern kingdom, still wandering with God, right? and still faithful. But a lot of this book has been Judah, look to the north. You're starting to have the same problems. Yeah, you're still faithful, but you're letting the influence creep in. And if I can do it to Israel, I can do it to you.
I think that verse 12 is really the contrast. God does all this for them, yet they're unfaithful. All this, and they still lie. They still go away. But God is always faithful.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the biggest themes of the book. It is a very much a contrast with God, right? Israel is lying and deceiving and not showing justice, mercy. Go down the list. And Israel's done all these awful things, but God's entire point is, I've done the opposite the entire time. When you showed, lying, I showed, telling the truth. When you, showed injustice, I showed you justice. When you didn't show mercy, I did show mercy. When you showed, a lack of faith, I showed faithfulness. And, the time has come. You've not changed. Judgment is here. Let's see. Jeff.
In verse 12 in the King James Version, it says, Judah yet ruleth with God and is faithful with the saints. That's I don't know, the one that Austin read didn't word it that way.
Mm-hmm.
What does yours say? I mean, saints, why did they translate it that way?
See, what my translation here says is Judah still wanders with God and is faithful to the holy ones. That's what I have. I'd have to get back with you on exactly why King James translates it saints, because I'd have to get into the Hebrew a little bit and take a look. And I know I haven't at the moment. But let me get back with you on that one.
I was thinking maybe it had some kind of prophecy about the coming of the church.
Maybe. Like I said, I'd have to dive into what the word is there and its uses in other places. But let me get back with you on that one, Jeff, and take a look, because that's an interesting translation. That is. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is probably a word choice type translator discussion. But I'll get back with you on it. Let me take a look at it. See, even I can go, I don't know. But any other questions or anything before we roll on to chapter 12?
Just the love part of it is the same God that we are dealing with here in the New Testament, and there's that part of it has been consistent throughout time. And I was busy looking at verses that such as where it says, there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free, there's no male or female, for you're all one in Christ. So, and I was trying to put Christians are the people that God loves, and He feels that way towards Christians today. Is the point I was wanting to make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, God loves Christians today, and He loves all people. That's the thing. There's no one God does not love. I mean, think about it. Israel is a rebellious people. God loves them. There's no rebellion that God just stops loving anyone over. Because, get it in the New Testament. The very nature and character of God is love. He shows us affection and care and concern no matter where we're at. And you see it even here with idolatrous Israel. Look, I've never done some of the things Israel is listed as doing. I've never killed someone. I've never, sacrificed to idols. I've never done all these things, right? But God still loved them even though they did that, right? Because at the same time, I haven't done those things, but I still have the same root problem. I'm selfish. I want to do what I want to do. I don't necessarily want to do what God says all the time. It's inconvenient for me. I have a sin problem. Welcome to humanity. We all do. We all have the same root problem. We don't always want to be faithful to the Lord. But God says, look, that's why I sent this guy called Jesus. from Nazareth. He's just like you. Except he's just like me too. And he showed you can be faithful. But it's through him you have to come to do it. And him dying on the cross for these sins you've committed. For the sins the whole world's committed. Because I love you. And I care. And I want you to be reconciled to me. Patrick.
This, in Numbers, the 23rd chapter, I know I'm jumping way back, but this is the confrontation with the children of Israel and Barak and Balaam. And one of the things that God has Balaam tell Barak is God is not a man, right? Because Barak wanted Balaam to get God to do what Barak wanted God to do. And the only reason that I bring that up, so that's there in Numbers 23, verse 19. God is not a man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. And so there's the relationship between that and Hosea, because God is going to do what God has said. And part of that's his love that he demonstrates. But what I want to point out is in the world today, we have to be careful because people will say to us, well, you're judging me, and that's not loving me. Because if you really love me, you just accept me the way I am and let me live my life the way I want to live my life. And so we have to be careful because that's thinking God's like a man. So I just wanted to throw that out, that this story of love is an extremely important story, but we need to keep in the back of our mind that sometimes man's definition of love isn't God's.
I think that's that's a really great point, Patrick, actually, when applying it to, well, judge not lest ye be judged. Yeah, God's love is not like a man's love. Man's love can be a very fickle thing. That's a huge point of Hosea. It has been a fickle thing. All right? Like, that's the whole problem. The moment something got inconvenient for them, they switched gods, literally. And I think we still have some of that same root problem today, right? You brought it up. You hear it a lot. That's judging me. That's not loving me. Well, I don't think that's what Christ is talking about there. Christ is saying, hey, don't make a call on something. Sin is still sin. We still have to be able to say that. Showing love is actually making that judgment. I'm sorry, but if I catch you lying, I'm going to say it because I care. That's the point. I'd much rather deal with the sin issue because that's actually loving you. Because it's the same thing God's trying to deal with. That's the point of Christ. Guess what? Christ on the cross is judgment. The whole world has sinned. And something has to pay the price. Someone paid the price. The cross is sacrifice, love, justice, mercy, and judgment. Love and judgment all in the same moment. Meaning through a man's bloodshed on the cross. Because God is still love. But he is still judgment. Okay, anything else on this? Well, if not, we'll be moving through to chapter 12 through 13, verse 3. No, it's a little bit of an odd breakup, but can I get somebody, well, real quick, before we start reading, this is a continued judgment section, but there's a new element added. There's a new historical allusion that's brought into the picture, right? And it's one I want to take some time to really walk through and talk about because I think this one's interesting because we don't get this kind of allusion a ton. So I had somebody to read verse 1.
Ephraim feeds on the wind and pursues the east wind all day long. They multiply falsehood and violence. They make a covenant with Assyria, and oil is carried to Egypt.
So we see the problem with Israel, right? Their love gets carried out to other nations. They make covenants with other people, and it just makes violence and everything worse. It's a sin issue.
I think it's deeper. They have no commitment to any
I think you're right. Yeah, I think this shows a lack of commitment even to the things they've committed themselves before God. They're not really committed to Assyria, but they're not really committed to Egypt either. They're really only committed to one thing: themselves. I've said it a few times. Idolatry is ultimately man's worshiping of man. It's convenience for man at the end of the day. But verse 1 just outlines the sins and the violence and just states outright who they've made their covenants with. Egypt and Assyria, not God. Why would I bother with that? It's not convenient for me. That's how they've acted. But this brings us to verses 2 through 6. Can I get somebody to read those for me?
The Lord also has a dispute with Judah, and will punish Jacob according to his ways. He will repay him according to his deeds. In the womb he took his brother by the heel, and in his maturity he contended with God. Yes, he wrestled with the angel and prevailed. He wept and sought his favor. He found him at Bethel, and there he spoke with us. Even the Lord, the God of hosts, the Lord is his name. Therefore return to your God, observe kindness and justice, and wait for your God continually.
So, verses 2 through 6 show whoever's reading a new historical allusion, right? It's specifically being applied to Judah, it seems. And what is this new historical allusion? Who's being referenced now? It's Jacob, right? Like, we haven't had this in Hosea yet, right? This is an allusion to Jacob, the Jacob narrative of Genesis. So we have to think about that. Now, this is a question that I think has an interesting answer. What does the name of Jacob mean in Hebrew? Usurper, deceiver, heel grabber. It's not a good name, right? It's kind of the point, actually. See, the point of Genesis is, look, God can take this usurper, this deceiver, and make something of him. Carry out his will through even somebody who was a lying cheat. That's the point of Genesis and Jacob. And actually, Jacob turns his life around in a lot of ways because of God. And here we are, right? In the womb, he grabbed his brother's heel, right? Judah, in many ways, is the younger brother of Israel. They're smaller, generally speaking. You know, they do end up lasting longer, historically, because, well, Israel's the firstborn in a lot of ways. They take the brunt of the punishment up front. And Judah still hangs out there. But guess what? They're grabbing that heel. They're following in the footsteps. Now, what's the big point in the life of Jacob where he truly begins to change? It's when he wrestles with God, it seems. It's when he actually has to confront, well, something beyond himself. We'll say that much, right? Angel, Christ, doesn't matter. The point is he's wrestled with God. So what's the point in referencing him here? Well, he turned his life around and they need to do the same. But I think, Jeff.
They're all his descendants. You can't very well act like you're better than your relatives. You're all his descendants.
Yeah, they're all his descendants. They all, they can't act like they're better than Jacob. Well, I think they're acting like Jacob before he turned around. But I think a lot of it is they're wrestling with God just like Jacob did. Right? They're having to actually, deal with this, wrestle with, God asked me to be something else. Do something different. And, a big part of that, Genesis 32 is where we get, the wrestling with God, is Jacob's name doesn't stay Jacob. Actually, it becomes Israel. Now, names typically carry a lot of meaning when you're reading through the biblical text. It's not like today, a lot of times, where, well, my parents liked the way it sounded, and therefore they named me that. It actually means something a lot of times. And Jacob, obviously, we talked about it, means deceiver, or usurper, or heel grabber, or whatever you want to say. But what does Israel mean? One who wrestles with God, one who contends with God. See, Jacob's name is changed to what he did in the passage. And if that is Jacob's name, and Israel bears that same name, what was the point of Israel? Well, they were to contend with God. The whole nation. Judah the same. The entire point is they are meant to work with God on this. Struggle with it. Contend with him. Right? That's a whole lot, right? Like, especially when you were reading through Moses and that, right? They come and they make demands and they ask things because they're working through this. They're wrestling with God the whole way. They've contended with God. The problem is they've stopped. They've stopped wrestling God. They've left the arena. They've started wrestling with other gods. They've wrestled with Baal and Assyria and all these things. They're trying to work with them. They're trying to be changed by them. They contend with God no more. Because or wrestling with God can go two ways. You're actually wrestling him like Jacob did, or you're wrestling with him. You're working on it together. And we see they failed. They've stopped. Israel no more. You stop contending with God, you will cease to be Israel. You will cease to be Judah. Anything on that? Well, yes. Wrestling is a team sport. Yep. Oh, Jeff, I love you. Okay. I think there is a particular line in here that's also of note, because it's another Jacob reference. It's not the wrestling moment of Genesis 32. It's, that line there, he found him at Bethel. Now, why would that strike our interest as readers of our Old Testament? There's that connotation, right? The removal of idols in Canaan. But I think there's an earlier one that still ties right back to Jacob. Actually, that's why the place is named Bethel. Genesis 28, 4 chapters earlier, from the wrestling with God. Bethel is a place that's actually been continually brought up in Hosea. We've just only had it called Bethel once the entire time. Anybody remember what it's up on the screen. Never mind. It's been mostly referenced as Beth Aven. It's only been referenced as Bethel one other time in the entire book. Back in chapter 10, if I remember correctly. But why is it called Bethel? Well, this is Genesis 28. If you want to look over there with me. Genesis 28 this morning. This is earlier on in Jacob's life than when he wrestles with God, has his hip dislocated, all that fun stuff. This is where he seems to truly have his first just encounter with, God. Pick up with me. We're going to start in verse 10. Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran. He reached a certain place and spent the night there, because the sun had set. He took one of the stones from the place and put it there at his head, and lay down at that place. And he dreamed. A stairway was set on the ground, with its top reaching the sky, and God's angels were going up and down it. The Lord was standing there beside him, saying, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, and the God of Isaac. I will, I will give you and your offspring the land on which you are lying. Your offspring will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out towards the west, the east, the north, and the south. All the peoples on earth will be pleased through you and your offspring. Look, I am with you and will watch over you. Wherever you go, I will bring you back to this land, for I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. When Jacob awoke from his sleep, he said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. He was afraid and said, What an awesome place this is. This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early in the morning, Jacob took up some that was near his head and set it up as a marker and poured oil on top of it and named the place Bethel. Now I got to find my place where I was reading in that. Though previously the city was named Luz. When Jacob was now made a vow, if God will be with me and watch over me during this journey I am making, he provided me with food to eat and clothing to wear, and I will return safely to my father's family. Then the Lord will be my God. This stone that I have set up as a marker will be God's house, and I will give you a tenth of all that you give me. See, Bethel is a place of historical significance to Israel. This is Jacob's, well, when he starts his commitment, it seems, or at least the roots of it are found here at Bethel. Now, what does Bethel mean? It's the house of God. Now, if it's the house of God, why does Hosea continually refer to it as Beth-aven and not Bethel? Well, I'm not sure on that one, but because this one's actually Hebrew wordplay, without a better way to put it. Hosea, obviously, he's kind of a poet, it seems. He likes big images and all these things. He's also a little, I don't know, sly in how he names things. Beth-aven means house of disaster in Hebrew. The house of God has become a house of disaster in Israel. The very opposite of what it started as for Jacob. Right? This is where we have Jacob have this dream of this stairway to heaven. And it starts to truly change who he is because he's encountered God. He's done what his future namesake will be. He starts contending with God. And he starts it where he calls the house of God. And Israel stopped contending with God and turned Bethel, the house of God, to Beth-aven, the house of disaster. They're no longer like Jacob. Israel no more. Judah is falling into the same problem. They are like Jacob. They're becoming like Israel. The people don't meet God at Bethel anymore, the house of God, like Jacob called it, but rather they're meeting Baal there, making it Beth-aven, the house of, disaster. And that little set of verses finishes with like this cry. That's how I at least read it, this like cry to return to God in love and justice and hope. Like when Hosea is speaking this, preaching this, writing this, however, he's pouring his heart out. We have to return. God's calling for us to return. God's pouring his heart out to us. We have to do the same. We have to come back. We have to return to God. So, anything else on that little chunk of verses? If not, we'll read verses 7 and 8. Can I get somebody to read those for me? I meant 7 and 8. I probably said through 10 without realizing it. But that's good there. So verses 7 and 8, it seems, well, to shift the focus back to Israel, right? Because it's talking about, well, their deceitful practices, right? I think it kind of, you get, to start the chapter, you get Israel, Judah, Israel, right? And up at the top, you get, well, you can't be faithful to any covenant you make. You weren't faithful to the covenant you made with God. You're not being faithful to the one you made with Assyria. You're not being faithful with Egypt either. And then you see Judah's having the same problem. Judah's, well, becoming kind of like Jacob was in the beginning. He's being a deceiver. He's being a problem. And guess what? Here we are. We're right back to Israel. And what's their problem? They're being deceitful. Right? Dishonest scales. They're extorting. And they're thinking, how rich have I become? I did this all myself. Their covenants only benefit them.
Covetousness, I think, is the primary thing covered here. When you go to Revelations chapter 3, verse 17, this is talking about the church at Laodicea. It says, and this would have been after, very close to the time of the destruction of Jerusalem or something. Some people would say that. Because you say, I am rich, and I have become wealthy, and I have need of nothing, and you do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, and blind, and naked. This is a church that supposedly followed Christ within a very short period of time. Covetousness totally run that congregation. And covetousness is a very easy sin for us to fall into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right. I think the overall sin here in this first little chunk of chapter 12 is they're covet a lot, which, God makes it very clear in the law not to covet, not to be jealous, not to want other people's things. And yeah, I think you hit it on the head. It's an easy sin to fall into, right? We all want things. It's natural. It's what comes to us easy, right? But well, Christ said, deny yourself. It's hard. And I think here in Hosea 12, you're seeing it is hard. People have failed. There's a reason Jacob's brought up, because Jacob and Esau, that initial story. Yeah, Esau makes a dumb decision. But Jacob shows a real problem with his heart, because he covets that birthright. And he, finds a deceitful way to get it. A very, as it says here, dishonest scale way to get it. He leans, you guess what? Esau, you get this bowl of soup. I get the promise. I get your birthright. They all have the same root problem that Jacob had. They're deceivers. They're deceitful. And they only covet things for themselves. Anything else before Jeff?
Analogy to the kingdom merchant is interesting to me because in verse 8 he says, I didn't do anything sinful. I made all this money honestly. Well, merchants don't actually make anything. They just buy and sell. And their whole point is they're going to make a profit off of buying and selling. And these people are told in verse 6 to observe mercy and judgment, but all they really care about is greed. And it doesn't matter who gets shortchanged as long as you didn't go to jail for it.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good way to think about it, especially with Israel, right? They're like, hey, look what I did. And nobody's going to get me for it. I'm not going to get punished for this. And, I think Hosea makes it pretty clear. Oh, somebody's going to get you for it. You've gotten caught.
Verse where it says that they were so greedy that they wanted the dirt on a man's head and would sell their brothers for a pair of shoes.
They get pretty extreme. Well, anything else on these set of verses? All right. Not. Can I get somebody to read 9 through 11?
I am the Lord your God, from the land of Egypt. I will again make you dwell in tents as the days of the appointed feasts. I spoke to the prophets, and it was I who multiplied visions, and through the prophets gave parables. There is a there is iniquity in Gilead, they shall surely come to nothing. In Gilgal they sacrifice bulls, their altars also like stone heaps, on the furrows of the field.
We see God here talk about, look, I've been your God since Israel when I took you out of slavery. And I'm going to be the one to return you to that state. You'll live in tents again. You'll have to observe festival feasts and all these things. It's a return to, well, Exodus. God says, I'm going to take you right back to where we started. Since, well, the land I have promised you is full of evil. You've abused the promise. You've abused the covenant. And because of that, I'm going to take you right back to before it started. Right back to the wilderness. She can't be faithful. Because Exodus, taking them out of Egypt, is one of the biggest images in the Bible of covenant faithfulness. It starts back with Abraham. God makes a covenant with Abraham saying, land, great nation, all nations shall be blessed. And by the time you get to Exodus, after you read Genesis, you're like, how is this going to work? They're a bunch of slaves. How is God faithful in this? And then this guy goes and stands in front of a burning bush. And God says, we're taking them out. They're coming out of the land. And he does it. He makes another covenant with them, saying, guess what? I've made a covenant with your father Abraham. Now I'm making a covenant with you. You're going to be my priesthood to the whole world. Just be faithful to me as I've been faithful to you. And God here makes it pretty clear. You haven't been faithful to that covenant, so you'll return to where we started. Anything on this? If not, can I get somebody to read 12 through 13?
Jacob fled to the country of Syria. Israel served for a spouse, and for a wife he tended sheep. By a prophet the Lord brought Israel out of Egypt. By a prophet he was preserved. Ephraim provoked him to anger most bitterly. Therefore his Lord will leave the guilt of his bloodshed upon him, and return his reproach upon him.
Verses 12 and 13 make another Jacob reference, right? In Genesis, Jacob really works to get a wife, right? Like, really works to get a wife. And God says, I've done no different with you. I've worked to have you in this covenant. I mean, I keep saying it, but Exodus. And then just keep reading after that and all the things God does to help them, especially when you get into Joshua and things like that. The supernatural things only God could do to be faithful to this covenant. God says, look, I've done my end. I've done my work. But yet you're still not faithful to me. God's done all the work Jacob did. Their ancestor did the work. Have they? God's done his work to receive his end of the faithfulness. They just haven't given their faith to him. Anything on that? If not, we'll finish this section out. Can I get somebody to read verse 14 of chapter 12 all the way through chapter 13, verse 3?
Ephraim provoked him to anger most bitterly. Therefore shall he leave his blood upon him, and his reproach shall his Lord return to him. When Ephraim spake trembling, he exalted himself in Israel, but when he offered in Baal, he died. And now they sin more and more, and have made them molten images of their silver, and idols according to their own
this ends this little section we're going to cover by just showing, well, how Israel's just accrued guilt through all his sin. There's some very intentional language here, things like blood guilt and some things like that are old law, like heavy usage words. They're in there all the time. So he's saying, look, this law I've given you, every aspect of it, you've accrued guilt. You violated it. And, well, going to be crushed and blown away. This is an exile image. He said, look, you've accrued all this guilt. You've caused all these problems. You've violated the law, the covenant that's been given. And because of that, crushed and blown away. So, anything on that? Well, if not, let's read verses 4 through 6 of chapter 13.
Yet I am the Lord your God, ever since the land of Egypt, and you shall know no God but me, for there is no Savior besides me. I knew you in the wilderness, the land of great drought. When they had pasture, they were filled. They were filled, and their heart was exalted. Therefore they forgot me.
So, verses 4 through 6 are just like a brief walkthrough of their history, right? It's like, I've been your God since Egypt, no Savior besides me. I knew you in the wilderness, and I brought you to a land with great pasture. And you became satisfied. And because you were satisfied, you became proud. Because you became proud, you forgot. It's that cycle again. Israel, well, restores itself to God. Then they start to sin. Then, well, consequence comes. And God's saying, Lord, this is where we're at. I've done all these things for you, and you've become proud and forgetful. You've forgotten the covenant. You've forgotten me. And that's the problem. They've become a people satisfied. It's an interesting use there of the word satisfied, because I don't think we should ever be satisfied on our end of our relationship with God. I think we always need to, well, stay away from this. We can't become proud and forgetful, satisfied people. Because, well, we always have something we need to fix. We always have some way we could work better with God, walk a little more faithfully. And I think that's the root problem God's starting here with Israel. You've become satisfied, you've become proud, and you forgot, hey, I still have a covenant to be faithful to. I have like 30 seconds left, so that's all we're going to do this morning. So thank you for the attention, and we will pick up here next week.